Welcome to Recalibrate Reality, the future of New York. I'm Scott Rechler, Chair of the Regional Plan Association and CEO and Chair of RXR. Working with the 92nd Street Y, we've launched a new conversational series where leading thinkers and decision makers answer the question, how do we recalibrate reality to create a better and brighter future for New York? Today, we have one of the newest members of the New York Congressional Delegation, Congressman Ritchie Torres. Whether it was during his time on the City Council or now representing the Bronx and the state of New York and Washington, Ritchie is someone who always puts aside political ideology for pragmatic, nonpartisan policymaking to benefit the broader community. And so, with that, let's recalibrate reality with Congressman Ritchie Torres. Congressman Torres, welcome to Recalibrate Reality. But before we even start, how does it feel to be referred to as Congressman Torres?
It's deeply gratifying. I never thought as a poor kid from the Bronx that I would embark on a journey that would take me from public housing in the Bronx to the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. So my response is only in America. And There's no one who's happier for me than my mother. She's my greatest cheerleader. When I came home from orientation, she said to me, I've never had dinner with a congressman before. And my mother's never been more excited about watching C-SPAN. So if my mother's happy, I must be doing something right.
That's really great. To me, when my mom's happy, that's the gold standard. I know I achieved something. Ritchie, now you're one of the youngest members of Congress. Before that, you were one of the youngest members of the City Council. So you're a great success story. You're a product of our city. So when you think back about when you were growing up, what were the experiences that helped you become the person that you are today?
For me, the starting point is public housing. For all its challenges, I would not be in the United States Congress were it not for public housing and the stability it gave me and my family. There are a few things in life that are as fundamental as safe, decent, affordable housing. I could only imagine, if I had been among the 60,000 people in our shelter system, right, a third of whom are children. Like imagine lurching from one shelter to the next or lurching from one school to the next. It's hard to succeed under conditions of housing instability. So I'm enormously grateful to the New York City Housing Authority for providing me with safe, decent, affordable housing. And I've made it the central mission of my life to advocate for the residents of public housing. I think a second contributing factor is education. Even though I received something of a mediocre education, the extracurricular enrichment was profoundly formative and transformative. When I was in high school, I had the opportunity to serve as the captain of the Lehman High School law team, the moot court team. And I discovered a talent for communication I never thought I had. It taught me how to think and read and write and debate critically. I had the opportunity to argue a case before actual judges of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in the face of relentless, rigorous questioning. And it prepared me not only for the City Council, but ultimately for the United States Congress. So I'm a huge proponent of extracurricular enrichment, which could have a transformative life effect on the life of a young person like myself. And then mentoring. You're only as good as the mentors you have in your life. And there was a former council member, Jimmy Vaca, who was the district manager in the Bronx. And he was looking for a young student to serve as his district manager for a day. And my principal recommended me. And so I met Jimmy Vaca about 15 years ago. And that fateful encounter began the journey that took me from the New York City Council to the United States Congress. So educational enrichment, mentoring, affordable housing. I'm a product of the New York City social safety net.
That's amazing. I mean, it sounds also like you were able to find your passion, right? Because that extracurricular and then even having that mentor, which then made this not about work. There was a love of learning, something that you became passionate about, right? Which is, I think, would be a key factor there. We're going to come back to public housing, so I want to talk more about it, but just to shift a little bit to where we are, when I think about you as a person watching you through the years, what's always been interesting to me is your pragmatic approach to politics, right? And realizing that it's not about ideological politics, but rather about policies to help the people. and you did that in city council, and now you're in the House of Representatives and have a chance to do that again, but in a really divisive environment in the House of Representatives right now. And so, how do you find that environment to be able to lean into your natural tendency to be pragmatic, find solutions, find compromises in a place where that just seems really difficult to do?
My answer to your question now, it would be different from what my answer would have been before the siege. That was a watershed moment for American politics. There's essentially a civil war, a cold civil war between Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. We are in a period of peak polarization in which there's deep animosity between Democrats and Republicans. And even though I think of myself as a pragmatist who strives to build coalitions and broker compromises wherever possible, I will admit to you that I struggle with the calls for unity. There were Republicans, about half of the Republican conference in the House voted to overturn the results of the election. There was a smaller subset of Republicans who incited the insurrection against the US Capitol during the Electoral College vote. And then there might have been a few Republicans who actively aided and abetted the insurrection. And so I ask myself, is unity even possible? Is it even desirable? Right? If you reject the peaceful transfer of power, if you're inciting insurrection against the Capitol, that's beyond the pale. Like, you and I can have debates about what constitutes the optimal rate of taxation in our society, but there should be no debate about the peaceful transfer of power. That is not up for negotiation. And so if you reject democracy and you reject the peaceful transfer of power upon which democracy depends, then there's no agreement on first principles that would form the basis for a working relationship. Right? It's one thing to have different values and beliefs, but if you have radically different facts and live in a radically different reality from my own, then it's a real challenge. And the Republican Party has done a disservice to the country. The siege on the Capitol was dangerously unprecedented. It led to the murder of a police officer who was bludgeoned to death by a fire extinguisher. And it could have done enormous harm to the political leaders of our city, our country, the vice president, the speaker, the majority leader, and members of Congress. So I do struggle with the calls for unity. And I'm curious to know, you've been supportive of both Democrats and Republicans. Any advice on how I should approach these Republicans? How are you going to approach them?
No, listen, I think you're right, that when it comes to the very nature of the bedrock of our democracy, being blatantly attacked, both in terms of the siege and then the sort of the rejection of the election in that vote, that's hard to do, right? And I think that the people that have made that decision, and even when I was watching that live, it really, to me, paralleled watching 9/11, watching our nation be attacked, watching a sacred place of our nation being attacked. But it was not foreign actors, but it was other U.S. citizens that were being directed by a sitting president, right? And so it's even more disturbing in that context. And so I think there is, for the people that have actually taken those steps, and the people, your colleagues that did not stand up and support the results of the election and certify them. I think it's a zero-sum game in that instance. I think that and I think from our standpoint as business leaders, and myself, we made it clear that there's not going to be any financial support. But at the same token, there are Republicans who did stand up, did do the right thing, in the face, frankly, of repercussions, not only to their career, but there's even potentially harm to themselves and their family based on the passions of some of those supporters right now. that I think also need to be supported, right? I think so. I don't know if I would say the whole Republican Party's out. I think that there's unfortunately, a civil war within the Republican Party, and I think that's incumbent upon um, us as a nation to try to support the people that have the courage to stand for the principles and values of our nation, and punish the ones that don't.
I agree with that. And look, I have deep respect for Peter Meyer from Michigan in the freshman class who spoke out against the insurrection and was one of the few to vote to impeach Donald Trump. It's much more courageous for a Republican to speak out against insurrection than it is for a Democrat. One quick thought. I think as a pragmatist, I see myself as a contrast to the extremes in our politics, but I feel like it's important to note that there's nothing on the left that is remotely comparable to the far right of the Republican Party, the Marjorie Greens of the world. There were many on the left, including myself, who were outraged that George W. Bush and Donald Trump won the presidency while at the same time losing the popular vote. But we recognize that the Electoral College is the law of the land and that we have to accept the outcome of the election. Right? There were no left-wing activists who stormed the United States Capitol in a violent attempt to derail the peaceful transfer of power. So I think what we've seen, not from all Republicans, but from too many Republicans, is a willingness to aid an unprecedented assault on our democracy. And the siege on the Capitol was not an accident. It was the culmination of a months-long delegitimation campaign waged by the president of the United States at the time, Donald Trump, and his enablers in Congress.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But here in New York, we don't have the kind of extremism that's taking place in Washington, but we are seeing more and more ideologically driven policy that's really at the expense of the policies that benefit the broader community. A good example is Amazon in Long Island City, or Industry City in Sunset Park. And Ritchie, to your credit, you publicly supported both projects, but unfortunately, other members who maybe were concerned about getting primaried didn't support the projects, and they failed. And we lost thousands of future jobs and other opportunities for people who live in those communities. So how do we get past this growing dynamic where the loud vocal few overwhelm sound policies that would help the community at large?
You're exactly right. A visible vocal minority can easily be mistaken for a majority. And part of the problem here is social media, which amplifies the ideological extremes in our politics. I feel like what's desperately needed is an infrastructure that cultivates the next generation of pragmatic leadership, just like the DSA is actively promoting the next generation of democratic socialist candidates. I think of myself as a pragmatic progressive. Like, for me, the central value of progressivism should be progress, right? As elected officials, we should be judged by the progress we create in the lives of the people we represent. And we should never let ideological purity be the enemy of progress, right? Our mission should be to make government work. Take Amazon, for example. In what universe does the destruction of 25,000 jobs and $27 billion in revenue represent progress? Like, for me, we should not be debating whether we should grow. We should be debating how we should grow. Right? Without growth, there's no affordable housing. There are no jobs. There are no revenues to fund public services that we all take for granted. Like, growth is the cornerstone of the New York City economy. And there need not be a conflict between equity and growth. We can strike a thoughtful balance between the two. There's no need to pursue one to the exclusion of the other. But what we've seen in New York City, it's become ground zero for the radicalization of progressive politics, embodied in the rise of the DSA. In the 2020 election cycle, the DSA won nearly every race. And I'm concerned about what implications that will have for governing. I respect activists. There is a role for activists to play in exerting pressure on elected officials to do the right thing or move the ball as far as we can, as much as we can. But in the end, the role of a legislator is different from that of an activist. Like, we have to be mindful of the realities and practicalities of governing. And I worry that our politics is becoming too radicalized and too ideological.
Right, and it's a politics of bright lines, right? You're either with us or against us, which is really challenging.
And it's too performative. Like, it's politics in New York City has entered the realm of the absurd. It's descended into a theatrical production, and Twitter is the stage, and everyone is performing. And that is not what governance, that's not the kind of governance we need when New York City is teetering on the brink of a fiscal crisis.
Right. And to your point about, you need equity and growth. I mean, the reality is much more difficult to create equity if you don't have prosperity, right? I mean, if you have prosperity, it's much easier to invest in programs, much easier to invest in education, much easier to invest in housing, et cetera. So when you cut through this, right, it comes down to the people. And, in your district, the 15th district in the Bronx, which you represent, really was hit hard. Pre-COVID, and frankly, COVID was really, really hard in terms of during COVID, the level of people that were laid off, the number of people that got sick, and unfortunately, the number of deaths in the spring, and even now, the economic crisis. When you talk to your constituents, like, what do you hear? It'd be good to get a sense as to really what do the people on the ground think, and what are their priorities? Is it public safety? Is it education? Obviously housing. What's on their mind right now?
All of the above, but what weighs most heavily on families in the South Bronx is economic insecurity. COVID-19 has been an economic catastrophe. The unemployment rate in the South Bronx can be as high as 25%, which is comparable to the joblessness of the Great Depression. There's been a catastrophic loss of income. There are families who are struggling to survive. The South Bronx historically has been known to be the poorest congressional district in America. But for me, COVID-19 has shown the South Bronx to be the essential congressional district. Right? It's the home of the essential workers who put their lives at risk during the peak of the pandemic so that most of us could safely shelter in place. And what those essential workers want is opportunity, right? Not a handout, but a fighting chance at a decent life. When I won my primary in June of 2020, I took the occasion to pay tribute to my mother. I said that the South Bronx is full of single mothers like mine who have struggled and suffered and sacrificed so that their children can have a better life than they did. That's what the essential workers and essential mothers of the South Bronx want. That's what all workers and mothers want, is a better life for their children. And that's where our focus should be in government. Our highest priority should be to put people back to work and to put income in the pockets of families who have been struggling mightily during COVID-19.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with this challenge of COVID right now. And you talk about your constituents wanting opportunity. One of the things that concerns me most about the impact of COVID was it indiscriminately took away people's jobs, no matter how hard they were working, what they were doing. And it really has put us in this have and have not economy. And, you referenced the essential workers that have been out there who didn't have the luxury to be able to stay at home and take shelter at the time of risk, but making our city tick. Yet you have these other, companies that were able to actually flourish while people worked from home. And one of the concerns I have is that as we look at this from a macro perspective, we're going to see sort of a V-shaped recovery on the surface. That's going to look like things are rebounding quickly because the haves are such a big part of the economy. But when you look below the surface, it's going to be this K-shaped recovery where all these people who were dislocated from the economy indiscriminately as jobs were lost are going to have a much more difficult time finding themselves back into the workplace. Because when restaurants close or small business closes, it's much harder to reopen them, right? It's hard for people to get credit. It's hard for people to have the confidence to do it after losing so much in this process. And the policies out of Washington, which now you'll have a chance to shape, have been more focused, I would say, on the bigger enterprises and building a bridge for employment and some business that survived to get through COVID. but really haven't yet focused on, in a post-COVID world, how are we going to create, bold, intentional policies that actually help bring these people back into the workforce? Because we've never lived through a dislocation like this before, where so many people were removed from the workforce and so many jobs have fully disappeared and are going to take so long to come back. Do you have any thoughts, or have there been any discussions within Congress about how to actually get directly to that segment of our community?
Look, there's no single solution. I mean, I agree with your analysis that we as a society have not fully come to grips with the depth of the COVID-19 impact. That there are families through no fault of their own who have been dislocated from their jobs, and the unemployment rate fails to capture long-term structural unemployment. I have businesses, on Arthur Avenue that have been owned by the same family for more than 100 years. These are businesses that have survived world wars and the Great Depression and the Great Recession and 9/11, and those businesses are struggling to survive. In education, I think one of the greatest challenges in education is the loss of learning during the summertime. Well, what is normally confined to the summertime, the loss of learning, has been linked in by COVID-19 to an extent we have not seen before. And that's going to have long and lasting consequences for the education of our students, especially students of color from the poorest parts of our city. So we have not fully come to grips with all of it. One policy that comes to mind for me is the child tax credit. For me, we have to commit ourselves to fighting poverty in America. And the structure of the child tax credit is so regressive at the moment that it excludes a third of American families, the poorest families in our country. And in the South Bronx, 2/3 of the families there are excluded from the full benefit of the child tax credit. And it's worth noting that child poverty costs our country $1 trillion every year. So research has shown that if we extend the child tax credit to the poorest families, we can cut child poverty by 40% in the span of 1 year. Right? We can make it so that your zip code does not determine your destiny. Right? In the United States, where you live should never be a ceiling on how high you can rise. So that's one example of what the federal government can do to bring relief to the communities that need it the most.
Yeah, again, gives again on the child tax credits, that gives each child the opportunity to sort of live a life like you lived, to find that passion and take advantage of education and mentors and grow that next level, which makes a lot of sense. On the business side, one area that I think is important is also we all need to take responsibility, right? I think we have to realize that our communities are suffering, and what makes New York special is the whole community ecosystem. So when you walk through our streets and the restaurants of those constituents of yours on Arthur Avenue who have, after generations need to close down, then you're taking away the character of Arthur Avenue. And so we all need to say, we need to invest in that future. We need to invest in that quality of life. We need to invest in those people, and we need to look at it differently than we did before. We can't look at this as just a transactional, business investment. We need to look at this as a community investment that will ultimately lead to a stronger community, which then leads to stronger businesses for many more. So I think that's something that we focus a lot on. I think more need to do so. The other area I'd imagine would be important when you think about your constituents is not just the insecurity from the economic environment, but public safety. So as you know, this past year, crime has gone up, and we've seen a disturbing increase in gun violence. And while the increase in crime may not be as severe as it was in the early 90s, any increase in crime in a community is a bad thing. So when you talk to your constituents, some who may have been impacted by the crime directly or have fear of the violence in the streets, and they hear things like defund the police, what do they think?
Well, one thing I can tell you is that Twitter is unrepresentative of the real world. Right? To be on Twitter, you would think that every New Yorker was in favor of defunding the NYPD by $3 billion. And I think what my constituents want is not more or less policing, but better policing. Is we can improve the quality and accountability of policing at the same time. Right? I think what I find painful about our public debate is that it creates a conflict where none need not exist. I suspect there is a broad consensus in favor of greater accountability in policing. There are people who might oppose defunding the police by $3 billion, which I consider irresponsible, but who would favor rethinking or even abolishing qualified immunity, or rethinking the blue wall of silence, and rethinking the practices that might enable the worst offenders in policing to engage in misconduct with impunity. So there's no need for this debate to be as polarized as it might appear to be on Twitter, because I do believe that there is a consensus in favor of rational police reform. We can have public safety and rational police reform at the same time.
Right. And again, here's an example. We're using sort of ideological logos like defund the police, take an extraordinary complex problem and try to simplify it to a level that it becomes binary. And I think, I think understates the importance of the issue and undermines, I think, the progress that we could actually have in addressing the issue.
No, it's government in the age of Twitter.
Right. Do you have a Twitter account, by the way, just out of curiosity?
Twitter? No, by necessity, but I don't draw my public policy from Twitter.
Right. That's smart. Well, we're speaking about issues that are complex. I want to talk to you about NYCHA, a subject that I know you're very passionate about. Nearly 500,000 residents live in what are pretty inhumane conditions. But unlike the subways, garbage not being picked up, or streets not being plowed, there isn't the same kind of collective outrage when it comes to fixing NYCHA. It not only feels like no one really wants to step up and fix it, but when someone does try and step in, it's incredibly challenging and complicated and frustrating. So who ultimately should be responsible for solving the problems with NYCHA, and how do we make it better for the residents living in public housing?
So, public housing is the central cause of my life. The New York City Housing Authority is the largest provider of affordable housing in the country. It houses a population of about 500,000 New Yorkers. I think of NYCHA as a city unto itself. And if it were a city unto itself, it would be the largest city of low-income Americans in the country. And it's been so savagely defunded at the hands of the federal government that it has a capital need of $40 billion and counting. So you have children who have been poisoned by lead, largely because of federal disinvestment. You have senior citizens who are freezing in their homes during the bitter cold of winter, largely because of federal disinvestment. But at the same time, for me, it's more than money. NYCHA is poorly managed, and it is time to rethink the framework for funding public housing. The notion that one central bureaucracy can efficiently manage 170,000 units of affordable housing, strikes me as absurd. And if the federal government has chronically underfunded public housing in the past, there's no reason to think the federal government is going to act any differently in the future. Right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result was Albert Einstein's definition of insanity. So we have to break out of the cycle of insanity and absurdity in relation to public housing. And I would tell people, look at most of affordable housing. Most of affordable housing is a public-private partnership. Most affordable housing is funded by the public, but operated privately for the public good. And it's been a success. So why not apply the same model of public-private partnership to public housing as we have done to the rest of the affordable housing stock, which by and large is a success, right? In the United States, we do have the right framework for funding most affordable housing. What we need is actually more funding. I would argue that as a society, we should invest as much in rental housing as we do in home ownership at the federal government. We should be doubling down on programs like the low-income housing tax credit and tax-exempt bond financing and home and Section 8. And so that to me, public-private partnerships, for me, is the most sustainable model for revitalizing public housing.
I completely agree. Public-private partnerships, and we've seen that in our infrastructure, which I think in public housing should be considered part of infrastructure. We use public-private partnerships to create discipline, innovation, transfer of risk, which is key. And then I think you find when you have that, projects are run better. In this case, housing would be run better. The experience is better. The money is spent more efficiently. And when you do all that, it's much easier to then ask for federal support to fund a program that you can validate that the money is being spent wisely. But I would argue, and I imagine you would agree, right, that the public housing challenge needs to be federally funded. There's no real state or city way to solve this problem.
Only the federal government can run a deficit, and only the federal government can address a $40 billion capital need. So,
right. And I think in this post-COVID world that we're talking about is things like this need to be structurally resolved, right? Just like we were talking about earlier about businesses that have closed down that need to be reopened and hire people. It's not going to happen naturally. We don't have systems. We don't have policies. Capitalism doesn't function in that way. So we need the government to intentionally come in and support it. And I think the same thing is true on housing that way.
And you made a powerful point. We have to think about not only the merits, but the politics, right? And if consider Section 9. Section 9 is urban rather than rural. And even among urban localities, it's overwhelmingly concentrated in New York City. It's public sector rather than private sector, and it's mostly has the support of Democrats rather than Republicans. Whereas Section 8 is both urban and rural, is both supported by Democrats and Republicans. Both the private sector and the public sector have a stake in the Section 8 program. And as a result, Section 8 has had a much more stable funding stream than Section 9. So there is a powerful political argument for converting traditional Section 9 public housing into Section 8 so that it has a much broader constituency in Washington, D.C.
And there's the pragmatic Ritchie Torres coming out to try to bring us policies that get something done, which makes a lot of sense. So we have a mayor race coming up. The Democratic primaries in June. 30 or so candidates have thrown their hat into the ring, but you've already come out and endorsed Andrew Yang. What was you thinking in backing Yang so early? And whether it's Andrew Yang or someone else, what's your advice for the next mayor of New York City with all the challenges that he or she will face on day one?
For me, the greatest argument for Andrew Yang is his independence. He's radically independent of a political establishment that has largely failed the people of New York. And for me, he represents an infusion of new ideas and new energy and new leadership in a time of unprecedented crisis. And he has the kind of independence that would liberate him to govern pragmatically. If he were mayor and if he were to approach an issue, he does not have to obsess about returning political favors to various special interests in the city. He can simply ask, is it the right thing to do? Is it the responsible thing to do? Is it good for New York and good for New Yorkers? And so I find that independence to be refreshing. Like, I'm someone who admires pragmatism and independence in public officials, and he possesses both. As far as the next mayor in general, I would advise you to learn from the experience of Bill de Blasio. When Bill de Blasio first entered the mayoralty, he famously said that he's not the pothole mayor. He was on a mission to anoint himself as the savior of a national progressive movement. And I would advise the next mayor to avoid delusions of grandeur and not to be enamored with your own press releases and embrace the role of a pothole mayor. Like, immerse yourself in the details of governing. And remember that governing is not an ideological enterprise. Governing at the local level is a practical enterprise. Right? Fiorello LaGuardia famously said, there's no Democrat or Republican way to pick up the garbage. Right? Much of what government does is about operations, it's about efficiency. And so I want a mayor who's going to be every bit as pragmatic, every bit as practical as the enterprise of local government itself.
Yeah, and I think when you look even now, what's happened through this whole COVID crisis at the federal level, and even some places in the city, you see how critical it is to have functioning government, right? And when the benefits you get from a government that functions well, and the cost we pay when government doesn't function well. And I think your approach to realizing that ideological politics can't trump pragmatic policies for the people is something that I think that will help differentiate you in Congress, and frankly could be the bridge to help some of that divisiveness that we spoke about earlier in our conversation. So I encourage you to keep that pragmatic approach, and as you said, you need progress to be pragmatic to have progress, and so I'm with you on that front, Ritchie.
I appreciate it, and thank you for everything you do for the city. And for me, the best of New York City is a partnership between business and government. We should combine the investment of government with the ingenuity of the private sector to solve problems. That's what government should be about.
Ritchie, thank you for the time today. It's great. Good luck with everything. Good luck with everything in your new role in Washington. Hopefully, it calms down for you a little bit in the coming weeks.
I hope so too. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, my friend. Be well. Thanks. That concludes this week's episode of Recalibrate Reality, the future of New York. As you just heard, we can and should create an environment where all of us can do well and do good at the same time. Or as I like to say, doing good and doing well means doing better. Thank you again to Congressman Ritchie Torres. Thank you to the 92nd Street Y and the Regional Plan Association. And thank you to the team who made this week's episode possible. Live from 75 Rockefeller Plaza, New York. See you next week.